I am not paying for this. You ordered way more than everyone else. Why are you attacking me? Because it is. It is!
My phone rang at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, and before I'd even fully said hello, my mother-in-law was talking over me, explaining breathlessly that my sister-in-law's engagement dinner had somehow run up a $9,200 bill at an upscale steakhouse downtown, and that the restaurant was refusing to let anyone leave until the check was settled. She asked me to simply read my card number over the phone, her tone carrying the casual, unquestioning certainty of someone who genuinely believed I would say yes without hesitation. I said no. By the following morning, every single relative in my husband's family had stopped speaking to me, several of them sending messages calling me selfish, cruel, and unworthy of being part of their family at all. Stick with me because what I discovered over the following weeks about exactly why my in-laws expected me, specifically, to cover that bill would completely transform how I understood my entire marriage. My name is Delphine Castellan. I'm 31 years old, and for 6 years, I've been married to Holden Pruitt, a genuinely kind, hard-working man whose family, I would eventually discover, had spent years quietly constructing a very specific narrative about my own financial situation, one that positioned me as the family's unofficial, unlimited financial safety net despite the fact that Holden and I lived a genuinely modest, careful lifestyle built around disciplined saving rather than the considerable wealth his relatives apparently mistakenly assumed we possessed. The dinner in question celebrated my sister-in-law Bethany's recent engagement, an event Holden's parents, Georgette and Rudolph Pruitt, had organized at an expensive downtown steakhouse without any prior discussion with Holden or me regarding budget, guest count, or who exactly would be expected to cover the considerable costs such an elaborate celebration would inevitably generate. I hadn't even attended that particular dinner, having stayed home that evening with a lingering cold, a detail that made the subsequent expectation that I personally cover the bill feel even more genuinely bewildering once I fully processed exactly what my mother-in-law was requesting during that late-night phone call, a request delivered with such casual confidence that it revealed, unmistakably, a long-standing assumption about my finances I'd never once consciously agreed to or even fully understood existed within my husband's family. To understand how my mother-in-law arrived at the confident assumption that I would simply cover a $9,000 dinner bill without hesitation, you have to understand a specific narrative that had apparently been developing within the Pruitt family for years, one I remained almost entirely unaware of until that devastating Saturday night phone call forced its full scope into painful, sudden clarity. I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized regional firm, a stable, respectable but genuinely modest profession that provides Holden and me a comfortable, though hardly extravagant, household income. Holden works as a high school science teacher, a profession he genuinely loves but one that, combined with my own income, places us firmly within a comfortable middle-class lifestyle rather than anything resembling the considerable wealth his family had apparently, mistakenly come to believe we possessed. I later learned through several difficult conversations following that devastating phone call, that this misunderstanding had originated years earlier, shortly after Holden and I purchased our first home, a modest but attractive property in a desirable neighborhood that we'd secured through years of careful saving and a substantial down payment funded partly through an inheritance from my own grandmother. Georgette, apparently, had toured that home during a family gathering shortly after our move, and had subsequently begun describing our financial situation to extended family members in increasingly exaggerated terms, transforming our genuinely modest, hard-won stability into an inflated narrative of considerable, effortless wealth that had apparently solidified into unquestioned family assumption over the following several years. I remember in hindsight several smaller moments throughout our marriage that should have alerted me to this developing misconception. Cousins mentioning offhand comments about how lucky Holden and I were, occasional requests for modest financial assistance that I'd attributed, at the time, to ordinary family closeness rather than any broader, mistaken belief regarding our actual financial resources. I'd simply never fully grasped how significantly this narrative had grown until that specific Saturday night, when my mother-in-law's confident, unquestioning request revealed exactly how thoroughly the entire extended family had apparently come to view me as their unofficial financial backstop. My sister-in-law Bethany, 28, had developed over recent years a well-established pattern of expensive, often impulsive spending decisions that her parents had consistently, quietly absorbed or covered without ever requiring genuine accountability or budgeting discipline from her directly, a pattern that had apparently gradually positioned other family members, including increasingly myself, as convenient additional funding sources whenever Bethany's spending exceeded what her parents alone felt comfortable covering. I learned, through conversations with Holden following that devastating phone call, that Bethany's engagement celebration had actually been planned with a considerably more modest budget in mind, one Georgette and Rudolph had genuinely intended to cover entirely themselves. However, Bethany had apparently made several last-minute additions throughout the evening, ordering premium bottles of wine for the entire table, requesting additional courses beyond what had originally been planned, and generally allowing the evening's costs to escalate considerably beyond her parents' original, modest budget without any apparent concern regarding who would ultimately need to cover the resulting difference. Holden explained with visible discomfort that this specific pattern had repeated itself multiple times throughout recent years: Bethany's birthday celebrations, a bridal shower for a mutual friend, even a family vacation 2 years earlier, each occasion involving Bethany spending exceeding whatever budget had originally been established, with the resulting financial gap quietly absorbed by various family members, myself included. On at least 2 previous occasions I genuinely viewed, at the time, as simple, reasonable family generosity rather than any broad or troubling pattern. I recognized, processing this information throughout the days following that devastating phone call, that Bethany's specific spending pattern, combined with the broader family narrative regarding my supposed considerable wealth, had apparently converged into an expectation that felt, to my in-laws, entirely reasonable and unremarkable, an expectation I'd never consciously agreed to but had, through my own previous willingness to help with smaller requests, inadvertently helped reinforce over several preceding years. I remember that Saturday night call with painful clarity, sitting on my couch, still genuinely unwell with a lingering cold, when my phone rang showing Georgette's name on the screen. I answered, expecting perhaps a brief update regarding how the evening had gone, entirely unprepared for what actually followed. "Delphine, thank goodness," Georgette said, her voice carrying genuine urgency rather than any apparent awareness that her request might strike me as unreasonable. "The bill here is absolutely enormous, over $9,000, and the restaurant won't let anyone leave until it's settled. Can you just read me your card number? We'll sort out reimbursement later, I promise." I sat there genuinely stunned by both the specific amount and the casual, unquestioning confidence with which Georgette had apparently decided I would simply provide it without hesitation or explanation. $9,000? I repeated, needing a moment to fully process what I was hearing. "Georgette, I don't have that kind of money readily available to just hand over on a phone call. And honestly, I wasn't even at the dinner. Why would I be expected to cover this?" The silence that followed my question carried a quality I'd never previously experienced from my mother-in-law, a stunned, genuine confusion that suggested she'd never once considered the possibility that I might decline, that my declining represented, in her own mind, something considerably closer to family betrayal than any reasonable financial boundary. "I just assumed," she said slowly, her tone shifting from urgent request into something considerably cooler, "that this wouldn't be a significant burden for you and Holden, given everything." She didn't elaborate on what everything specifically referenced, but her tone made unmistakably clear that she was drawing on some broader assumption regarding our finances that I, in that exact moment, still didn't fully understand the origin or scope of. I explained, as calmly as I genuinely could manage given my own growing shock, that Holden and I simply didn't have $9,000 available for an unplanned expense, that we lived a careful, budgeted lifestyle rather than the considerable wealth she apparently believed we possessed, and that regardless of our actual financial situation, covering an entire family dinner bill for an event I hadn't even attended felt like an unreasonable expectation regardless of circumstances. Georgette's response, a clipped "I see" followed by an abrupt end to the call, left me sitting there, genuinely bewildered, with absolutely no idea how significantly that specific conversation was about to reshape my entire relationship with Holden's extended family. I woke the following morning to a genuinely overwhelming number of messages from various Pruitt family members, messages that had apparently begun accumulating throughout the early morning hours, each one carrying some variation of the same accusatory theme: that I was selfish, that I'd humiliated the family by allowing the dinner situation to become genuinely uncomfortable, that my refusal represented a fundamental betrayal of family loyalty and values. Holden's aunt, someone I'd always maintained a warm, if not particularly close, relationship with throughout our marriage, sent a message describing me as shockingly ungrateful given, in her words, everything this family has done for you. Language that genuinely bewildered me given that I couldn't immediately identify any specific significant support the extended family had provided that would warrant such characterization. Several cousins I rarely interacted with directly sent similarly critical messages, apparently having received some version of events from Georgette that painted my declining as considerably more callous and unreasonable than the actual, genuine financial constraint I'd attempted to explain during that difficult phone call. I learned, through Holden's careful investigation over those following days, that Georgette had apparently described the situation to extended family members in a way that omitted any mention of my stated inability to simply produce $9,000 on short notice, instead framing my refusal as simple, calculated selfishness from someone who clearly had the money but just didn't want to help. Holden, genuinely troubled by his family's rapid, coordinated turn against me, spent that entire difficult Sunday attempting to reach various relatives directly, explaining our actual financial circumstances and defending my reasonable, measured response to an unreasonable last-minute request. His efforts, though genuinely appreciated, met with limited success throughout that initial difficult day, several relatives apparently having already firmly settled into a narrative regarding my supposed selfishness that proved considerably resistant to correction or reconsideration once established. I spent the following week processing genuine hurt and confusion alongside growing determination to understand exactly how this specific narrative regarding my finances had developed so extensively throughout Holden's extended family without my own awareness, working carefully alongside Holden to piece together a more complete picture of exactly what had been happening throughout recent years. Holden's cousin, Marguerite, someone who had always maintained a somewhat more independent, clear-eyed perspective regarding the broader family dynamics, agreed to speak with me directly once she learned about the situation, providing genuinely valuable insight into patterns I'd never fully recognized throughout my own years within the family. "This isn't really about you specifically," she told me during a lengthy phone conversation. "It's about a pattern this family has developed where Bethany's spending gets absorbed by whoever seems most capable of covering it, and lately that's increasingly meant you and Holden, mostly because Georgette has spent years telling everyone how well you two are doing financially. Probably because it makes her feel better about how much she's spent covering Bethany's choices over the years." I learned, through this and several subsequent conversations, that Georgette and Rudolph's own retirement savings had been genuinely, significantly depleted over recent years through repeated, quiet coverage of Bethany's various spending patterns, a financial strain they'd apparently never directly acknowledged to extended family, instead maintaining an outward appearance of comfortable stability while increasingly, quietly hoping other family members, myself included, would help absorb costs they could no longer genuinely, comfortably manage entirely on their own. This understanding, while genuinely clarifying regarding the broader family dynamics at play, didn't make the specific betrayal I'd experienced feel any less genuinely painful, understanding now that I'd apparently been positioned, without my knowledge or consent, as a convenient solution to a financial strain the family had created through years of enabling Bethany's spending rather than establishing genuine, appropriate boundaries considerably earlier. I made a deliberate decision, throughout that difficult week, not to simply capitulate to the mounting family pressure by belatedly offering to cover the disputed bill, understanding clearly that doing so would only reinforce the exact pattern that had created this entire painful situation, confirming to the extended family that sufficient guilt and social pressure would eventually secure whatever financial contribution they'd initially expected. I requested a family meeting instead, working with Holden to arrange a conversation involving his parents directly, wanting to address the underlying situation honestly rather than simply allowing the current tension to fester indefinitely without any genuine resolution or clarity moving forward. Georgette and Rudolph arrived for that meeting still carrying visible resentment regarding my initial refusal, though Holden's continued advocacy throughout that preceding week had apparently softened their position somewhat compared to the immediate aftermath of that devastating Saturday night phone call. "I need you both to understand something clearly," I told them, my voice carrying a calm firmness I'd spent considerable time preparing throughout that difficult week. "Holden and I live a genuinely modest, careful financial life. We don't have unlimited resources available for unplanned expenses, regardless of whatever impression has developed within the broader family regarding our finances. And even if we did have those resources readily available, I don't think it's reasonable to expect me to cover an entire family dinner bill for an event I wasn't even present at, without any prior discussion or agreement. Rudolph, notably quieter throughout most of our marriage's family gatherings, spoke up during this specific conversation with what felt like genuine, if somewhat belated, reflection. "I think we've let Bethany's spending become everyone's problem for too long," he admitted, glancing toward Georgette with an expression suggesting this specific acknowledgement represented a conversation they'd likely been avoiding directly addressing between themselves for considerable time already. The family meeting ultimately prompted a considerably broader conversation regarding Bethany's spending patterns that extended well beyond the specific dinner bill dispute, Georgette and Rudolph finally acknowledging directly, in front of both Holden and me, the genuine financial strain Bethany's repeated spending decisions had placed on their own retirement savings throughout recent years. Bethany herself, once included in a subsequent family conversation specifically addressing this broader pattern, initially responded defensively, characterizing the entire discussion as unfair scrutiny of her engagement celebration specifically rather than genuine acknowledgement of a longer pattern extending considerably beyond that single evening. Her defensive response, though understandably difficult for her personally to hear, ultimately proved necessary in finally establishing clearer boundaries regarding future family financial expectations that had, until that point, remained entirely unspoken and unexamined despite years of accumulated strain. Georgette and Rudolph, working through this difficult family reckoning, ultimately established, with Bethany's reluctant but genuine agreement, a clearer framework for future celebrations and family expenses, one that required upfront budgeting discussions and genuine accountability for any spending decisions exceeding previously agreed amounts, rather than the previous pattern of quiet, after-the-fact absorption by whichever family member seemed most capable of covering the resulting difference. I didn't personally orchestrate this broader family reckoning, my own involvement limited entirely to declining an unreasonable request and subsequently insisting on honest, direct conversation regarding the underlying assumptions that had led to that request in the first place. But I recognized, watching this broader family conversation unfold over those following weeks, a genuine meaningful shift toward the kind of honest accountability that had apparently been missing from the family's financial dynamics for considerably longer than the specific incident that had ultimately, painfully forced it into necessary, overdue examination. My relationships with various extended family members rebuilt gradually over the following months, several relatives who had initially responded with genuine criticism eventually reaching out directly once they'd learned the full, accurate context regarding both my actual financial circumstances and the broader pattern their initial, incomplete understanding had failed to fully capture. Holden's aunt, who had initially characterized me as shockingly ungrateful, called me directly roughly 2 months after the initial incident, offering a genuine, thoughtful apology once she'd learned the complete situation, acknowledging that she'd reacted based on an incomplete, distorted account rather than genuinely understanding the actual circumstances and reasonable boundary I'd attempted to establish during that difficult phone call. My relationship with Georgette specifically required considerably more time and effort to genuinely rebuild. The initial betrayal of her immediate, harsh characterization of my reasonable boundary to extended family members having created a deeper strain than some of my other, more peripheral family relationships. We eventually reached a more honest, if still somewhat careful, understanding through several difficult but genuinely productive conversations throughout that following year, Georgette eventually acknowledging directly, during one particularly meaningful conversation, that she'd allowed her own financial anxiety regarding Bethany's spending patterns to unfairly shape unreasonable expectations regarding my own resources and obligations. Bethany's relationship with the broader family also shifted considerably throughout that period, the new financial boundaries her parents had established requiring genuine adjustment on her part that, while initially difficult, ultimately appeared to prompt more thoughtful, deliberate financial decision-making than her previous pattern of unconstrained spending had ever required or encouraged throughout her adult life. Standing at a family gathering roughly 2 years after that devastating Saturday night phone call, watching Bethany's own wedding celebration unfold with a considerably more modest, carefully budgeted approach than her earlier engagement dinner had involved, I thought often about everything that had unfolded since that specific painful evening when an entire extended family had apparently briefly turned against me for declining an unreasonable financial expectation I'd never consciously agreed to in the first place. I'd learned, throughout that difficult period, something genuinely important about the specific courage required to maintain reasonable boundaries even when doing so triggers significant, immediate social consequence, understanding that genuine family relationships, the kind actually built on mutual respect and honest communication, ultimately prove considerably stronger for having weathered honest conflict rather than simply avoiding it through continued, quiet accommodation of unreasonable expectations. Holden and I grew genuinely closer throughout that entire difficult experience, his consistent advocacy on my behalf throughout those initial difficult days, and his own willingness to have genuinely difficult conversations with his own parents regarding long-accumulated family patterns, representing exactly the kind of partnership and mutual support I valued most significantly throughout our marriage. I maintain, even now, a considerably more honest, appropriately boundaried relationship with Holden's extended family, one built on realistic understanding of our actual financial circumstances rather than the inflated, mistaken narrative that had previously shaped unreasonable expectations regarding my supposed obligations. I don't regret declining that initial request, regardless of the genuinely difficult, immediate consequences that decision triggered throughout my extended family relationships, understanding clearly that whatever temporary social discomfort resulted from that boundary ultimately proved considerably less costly than the alternative. Continuing to quietly absorb financial expectations I'd never genuinely agreed to, built on assumptions about my life that had never actually reflected reality in the first place.